When we think of ancient Greece, we imagine marble temples, wise philosophers, and the birthplace of democracy. But hidden behind the polished statues and heroic myths lies a world far more complex and far more shocking. The Greeks were not just thinkers and warriors. They were explorers of human desire, pushing boundaries that even today might make us blush. In a society where gods walked among mortals, at least in the imagination, sexuality was not merely private pleasure. It was ritual, religion, and sometimes even politics. From sacred prostitutes serving in the temples of Aphrodite, to secret Dionysian orgies that blurred the line between ecstasy and madness, to relationships between older men and boys that were celebrated as noble mentorship, the Greeks lived in a world where desire was both celebrated and controlled by strict customs. What we might see as scandalous, they saw as sacred. What we consider taboo, they believed could honor the gods. Prepare to step into a world where love, lust, and ritual intertwined, and discover the most bizarre sexual practices of ancient Greece that shaped the very foundations of Western civilization. If Section 1 revealed the philosophy and mindset of ancient Greece, Section 2 takes us into the heart of their temples, where sexuality was not just tolerated, it was sanctified. To the Greeks, desire was not a dirty secret. It was an offering, an energy that could be directed toward pleasing the gods and ensuring prosperity for the city. One of the most talked about aspects of Greek sacred sexuality was temple prostitution, especially in the worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. In cities like Corinth, her temple was said to have housed hundreds of sacred prostitutes. These women were not considered shameful or immoral. Far from it. They were priestesses performing an act of devotion. A man who visited the temple and paid for their company was not merely seeking pleasure. He was offering a gift to the goddess, a symbolic sacrifice that blessed him with fertility, good fortune, and divine favor. Imagine the scene. A temple courtyard lit by flickering oil lamps, the fragrance of incense heavy in the air, statues of Aphrodite smiling serenely as worshippers come forward to make their offerings. Each act of intimacy was seen as a reenactment of the goddess's own power, a way to participate in the eternal dance of love that kept the world alive. But Aphrodite was not the only deity connected with these rituals. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, had perhaps the wildest following. His mystery cults were famous or infamous for their frenzied celebrations. During the Bacchanalia, as the Romans later called them, worshippers would gather in secret, drink wine until they were nearly possessed, dance to the sound of drums and flutes, and sometimes engage in orgiastic rites meant to dissolve the boundaries between mortals and gods. To an outsider, these scenes would look chaotic, even dangerous. Women tearing through the hills in ecstatic trances, men and women abandoning their normal identities to become one with Dionysus. Yet for the participants, this was liberation. By losing control, they believed they were breaking free of ordinary human limitations, touching something divine. Another fascinating ritual practice was hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. This was a ceremonial union between a mortal and a deity, often represented by a priestess and a priest or king. In some cases, this ritual would involve an actual sexual act performed in the temple, symbolizing the union of heaven and earth, spirit and matter. The community believed that this act ensured fertility for the land, good harvests, and divine protection. Even festivals like the Panathenaea and the Anthesteria contained elements of sexuality. The latter was a festival of Dionysus, celebrating the opening of new wine jars, and it had a deeply sensual character. The wife of the king Archon, one of Athens' top officials, would undergo a ritual union with the god, again symbolizing fertility and renewal. We cannot ignore the Eleusinian mysteries, perhaps the most famous of all Greek religious rites. While the exact details remain secret, initiates were forbidden to speak of what happened. Ancient sources hint that sexual symbolism played a role in the ceremonies. The mysteries were about death and rebirth and what could symbolize life more powerfully than the union of male and female. Of course, not everyone approved of these practices. Even in ancient Greece, there were critics who saw them as excessive or dangerous. Philosophers like Plato worried that unrestrained passion could lead to chaos in society. Playwrights used comedy to mock temple prostitutes or drunken celebrants, suggesting that not everyone embraced this open approach to sexuality. Still, For the majority of Greeks, these rituals were a necessary part of life. They were a way of keeping the cosmic balance. If you neglected the gods, if you refused to honor them through the proper rites, you risked disaster. Failed crops, disease, war, all could be seen as punishment for failing to please the divine. What's fascinating is that these rituals were not limited to one class of society. Rich and poor, citizen and foreigner could participate. The temple was a great equalizer. For a brief moment, social hierarchies disappeared. A powerful politician and a humble farmer might stand side by side, making offerings, seeking the same blessing from the goddess. From a modern perspective, these sacred sexual acts might seem shocking, even scandalous, but to the Greeks, they were as natural as planting seeds in the earth. Just as the farmer fertilized his fields to ensure a harvest, so too did the community fertilize its spiritual life through ritual union. These practices remind us that sexuality, for the Greeks, was not merely a private indulgence but a public, even cosmic responsibility. It connected humans to the divine order, reminded them of their place in the universe, and gave them a sense of participating in something greater than themselves. As we leave the temple and step back into the city, we carry with us a deeper understanding of how the Greeks saw the link between desire and destiny. In the next section, we will explore a practice that continues to spark controversy today, pederasty, and uncover how relationships between older men and younger boys shaped education, politics, and even the ideals of beauty in ancient Greece. When we picture ancient Greece, we often imagine a land of breathtaking marble temples, philosophers debating beneath the shade of olive trees, and heroic athletes competing in the Olympic Games. This romantic vision, while partly true, hides a much stranger and darker side of Greek culture, a side that dealt not only with philosophy and politics, but with passion, desire, and taboo. Ancient Greece was not simply the birthplace of democracy. It was also a society where sexuality played a central role in religion, art, and everyday life. To understand why this is so fascinating, we have to set aside our modern assumptions about intimacy and morality. For the Greeks, sexuality was not confined to the bedroom or treated as something private and shameful. Instead, it was public, ritualized, and deeply connected to their spiritual worldview. In their eyes, desire was a natural force, something that could be celebrated, worshipped, and even offered as a sacrifice to the gods. Imagine walking through the streets of Athens during a great festival. The air is filled with music and laughter, wine is flowing freely, and crowds gather to honor Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. Masked performers act out wild plays filled with bawdy humor, erotic jokes, and shocking scenes that make even the elders laugh. Erotic imagery is everywhere, painted on vases, carved into temple walls, and woven into myths retold around the fire. This openness did not mean that Greek sexuality was free of rules. In fact, it was full of them. But the rules were different from ours. Who you could love, when you could love, and even how you could express that love were dictated by a complex web of customs, traditions, and rituals. Breaking these customs could bring shame not only on you, but on your entire family. In many ways, sex in ancient Greece was not just a private act, but a public duty, tied to honor, fertility, and even the survival of the city-state. One of the most fascinating aspects of Greek sexuality was its link to the divine. To the Greeks, love and desire were gifts from the gods, sometimes blessings, sometimes curses. The goddess Aphrodite was believed to inspire irresistible passion, while Eros, the mischievous god of love, could strike anyone with his golden arrows, driving them to madness with desire. Sexuality was a way to participate in the divine order of the universe, to feel closer to the gods themselves. This is why many Greek temples featured rituals that modern audiences would consider shocking. Fertility rites, sacred prostitution, and symbolic marriages between mortals and gods. But there was another side to Greek sexuality, one that made it both fascinating and controversial. Relationships between older men and younger boys, known as pederasty, were not only tolerated but sometimes celebrated as a form of mentorship and education. These relationships were surrounded by rules meant to distinguish them from mere exploitation. They were supposed to be based on mutual respect and aimed at helping the boy grow into a virtuous man. Nevertheless, to a modern reader, they raise difficult questions about power, consent, and morality. Ancient Greek sexuality also had a political dimension. Marriage, for example, was less about romantic love and more about producing legitimate heirs to carry on the family name. Women were often married young, sometimes to much older men, and were expected to bear children as their primary duty. At the same time, male citizens often found emotional and sexual companionship outside of marriage, with courtesans, with boys, and in some cases with other men. The result was a society where erotic life was fragmented into many different spheres, each with its own rules and expectations. All of this created a culture that was at once deeply sensual and highly regulated. Sex was everywhere, in festivals, in art, in religion, yet it was also controlled by tradition and shaped by philosophical debates. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle wrote extensively about love and desire, exploring their role in the pursuit of virtue and the good life. In Plato's Symposium, for example, love is portrayed as a ladder that leads the soul upward from physical attraction to divine beauty. This complex interplay of pleasure, duty, and spirituality is what makes the sexual life of ancient Greece so mysterious and compelling. It forces us to confront questions about our own attitudes toward desire. Are we, with all our modern freedoms, really more liberated than the Greeks? Or have we simply hidden sexuality behind closed doors? Section 1 sets the stage for exploring these questions in greater depth. To truly understand the bizarre sexual practices of ancient Greece, we must look not just at the acts themselves, but at the world that produced them. A world where gods were everywhere, where pleasure was sacred, and where the boundaries between love, power, and ritual were constantly being crossed. In the next section, we will step into the temples and mystery cults where sexuality was used to worship the divine. From sacred prostitutes serving Aphrodite to the wild Dionysian rites that shocked even the Greeks themselves, we will see how these ancient people turned intimacy into a form of religious devotion, and how that shaped everything from politics to philosophy. If the sacred rituals of the temples revealed how sexuality connected mortals to the divine, then the practice of pederasty shows us how desire was tied to education, mentorship, and social power in ancient Greece. It is perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of Greek life, often misunderstood and fiercely debated by historians. To understand it, we must enter the symposiums and gymnasiums of the Greek elite, where the next generation of citizens was shaped, both intellectually and sometimes erotically. Pederasty comes from the Greek word paiderastia, literally meaning love of boys. In its idealized form, it was a relationship between an older man, called the erastes, the lover, and an adolescent boy, called the eromenos, the beloved. But this was not a casual or purely physical affair. In theory, it was meant to be an educational and moral partnership. The older man was expected to guide the youth, teaching him philosophy, politics, warfare, and the responsibilities of citizenship, while also cultivating his character and virtues. Imagine an Athenian gymnasium, young men exercising naked, which was common practice, philosophers lecturing under the porticos, and older men watching, choosing potential protégés. The Greeks celebrated the beauty of the youthful male body, and this admiration was not considered shameful, but natural, even noble. The Erastes would court the eromenos, offering gifts such as wreaths, hairs, or wine, and the boy had the right to refuse until he was convinced that the older man was honorable and sincere. Once the relationship was established, it was supposed to be based on mutual respect. The boy was expected to preserve his dignity, never becoming passive or effeminate, while the older man was expected to be a role model, never crossing the line into exploitation. In this idealized version, the bond was as much about shaping the boy's soul as it was about physical intimacy. But the reality, of course, could be far more complicated. Critics in ancient Greece, including philosophers like Plato, worried the pederasty could easily descend into mere lust, corrupting both parties. In Laws, Plato warned that sexual indulgence could distract citizens from their duties and weaken the moral fiber of the state. Others feared that these relationships could create private loyalties that competed with loyalty to the city, undermining democracy. Nevertheless, pederasty remained an accepted and even celebrated institution in many city-states, particularly in Athens and Sparta. In Sparta, for example, relationships between older and younger males were encouraged as a way of building bonds between soldiers. The idea was that warriors who loved one another would fight more bravely, protecting each other on the battlefield. Art and literature of the time reflect both the beauty and the tension of these relationships. Vase paintings often depict courtship, scenes with the older man touching the chin of the younger boy, a gesture symbolizing affection and respect. Poets like Theognis and Anacreon wrote verses celebrating the love of boys, praising their beauty as an inspiration for noble deeds. From a modern perspective, this practice is extremely troubling, raising difficult questions about consent and power imbalance. We must remember that in ancient Greece, adolescence was seen differently. Boys were considered on the threshold of manhood, and their participation in such relationships was framed as a step toward becoming full citizens. But that does not erase the ethical complexities. Even then, some Greeks criticized pederasty, arguing that it could humiliate the boy or turn him into an object rather than a future equal. It is also important to note that these relationships were highly regulated. A citizen man could not simply pursue any boy he wished. There were strict social codes. If he acted dishonorably, using force or seeking only physical pleasure, he could be shamed publicly. The family of the boy had to approve, and the relationship was expected to end once the youth reached adulthood, usually around the time he grew a beard. The power dynamics of pederasty also reveal something deeper about Greek society. These relationships were part of a world where men held most of the political and social power, and where women were largely confined to the domestic sphere. For many Greek men, emotional and intellectual companionship came from other men, not from their wives. Marriage was primarily for producing heirs, while pederasty was seen as a way to cultivate virtue and civic responsibility. This does not mean that love was absent. Ancient sources describe genuine affection, loyalty, and even heartbreak between Erastes and Eromenos. Some pairs remained lifelong friends and allies, their bond shaping political alliances and influencing the course of history. The Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite military unit made up of 150 pairs of male lovers, became legendary for their courage, defeating even the mighty Spartans in battle. Ultimately, pederasty was both a reflection of Greek ideals and a source of moral anxiety. It showed how the Greeks celebrated beauty, mentorship, and the power of eros, but it also exposed the risks of combining desire with education and authority. To us, it serves as a reminder that every culture has its own way of negotiating the tension between passion and power. As we move forward, Section 4 will take us out of the private world of mentorship and into the public sphere, where sexuality became part of festivals, theater, and daily life, openly displayed for all to see, celebrated in art, and woven into the very identity of the polis. If pederasty revealed how intimacy shaped education and mentorship, public festivals and art show us how sexuality shaped the collective life of the Greek city-state. In ancient Greece, sexuality was not something to be hidden behind closed doors. It was woven into the very fabric of public culture. To walk through Athens, Corinth, or Sparta was to encounter erotic imagery on pottery, statues, and temple walls. Desire was not an embarrassment. It was part of the civic identity, a force that tied individuals together and honored the gods. Consider the theater. Greek drama was not a quiet, polite affair. Comedies by playwrights like Aristophanes were filled with sexual humor, innuendo, and even outright obscenity. In plays like Lysistrata, women threaten to withhold sex from their husbands until they agree to end a war, a plot that is both funny and deeply revealing about how sexuality was seen as a tool for negotiation and power. These plays were performed in front of entire cities, with thousands of spectators laughing together. This was not just entertainment. It was a communal act of exploring human nature, including its most intimate desires. Public festivals also celebrated sexuality openly. The Dionysia, held in honor of Dionysus, was both a theatrical and a religious event, featuring processions where participants carried giant phalluses through the streets. These processions were not meant to shock but to invoke fertility and abundance. The phallus was a symbol of life, growth, and divine blessing, and displaying it proudly was considered a way to invite prosperity for the entire community. The Panathenaia, one of Athens' most important festivals, celebrated Athena, but it also featured athletic competitions where men competed completely nude. This was not merely a display of physical strength, it was an aesthetic celebration of the human form. The Greeks believed that the male body in its prime was the pinnacle of beauty, a reflection of divine perfection. Spectators, men, women, and even children, watched as competitors wrestled, raced, and threw discus under the blazing sun, their bodies glistening with olive oil. This public nudity was not considered shameful but virtuous. It represented honesty, courage, and readiness for battle. To hide the body was to hide its beauty and deny its connection to the gods. The word gymnasium itself comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked. Physical training was a form of worship, an offering of the perfect body to the divine. Erotic imagery was everywhere in daily life. Pottery used for drinking wine at symposia, drinking parties, often depicted explicit scenes, men courting boys, couples embracing, scenes of seduction. These images served as conversation starters, philosophical prompts, and a reminder that pleasure was an accepted part of existence. Far from corrupting the mind, they were meant to inspire contemplation of love, beauty, and morality. Women also had their own festivals that celebrated sexuality, though these were often kept secret from men. The Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter, was exclusively for women and involved rituals connected to fertility and the cycles of life and death. Ancient writers hint that these rites included sexually symbolic acts, though the exact details remain shrouded in mystery. This secrecy gave women a rare space for autonomy, where they could express desires and concerns outside the male-dominated public sphere. Even public architecture reflected erotic ideals. The statues of Kuroi, youths, and Korai, maidens, that lined sanctuaries and graveyards celebrated the beauty of young bodies. Their serene smiles and perfect proportions were meant to capture an ideal of harmony between the human and divine. To gaze at such statues was not just to admire physical beauty, but to contemplate virtue, balance, and the perfection of the cosmos. Of course, there were limits to this openness. Adultery was considered a serious crime, punishable by law. Women's sexuality in particular was tightly controlled outside of ritual contexts. A citizen woman was expected to remain faithful to her husband, and her primary role was to bear legitimate heirs. Courtesans, hetairai, however, lived outside these restrictions. They were educated, witty, and often served as companions to powerful men, engaging in intellectual as well as erotic exchanges. What's striking is that Greek public sexuality was not merely about pleasure, it was about creating unity. When an entire city participated in a festival, sang hymns together, laughed at obscene jokes, and watched erotic plays, they were reminded that desire was a shared human experience. These events dissolved barriers between rich and poor, citizen and foreigner, allowing everyone to participate in the joy and responsibility of honoring the gods. From a modern perspective, the sheer visibility of sex in the body in Greek society is startling. In our world, such things are often considered private or even scandalous. But to the Greeks, hiding the body would have been a kind of blasphemy. Their openness was a declaration. To be human was to be sensual, and to be sensual was to be part of the divine order. As we move into the final section, we will step back and look at the legacy of these practices. How did this openness shape later Western culture? And what can these bizarre yet strangely beautiful customs teach us about our own complicated relationship with desire? After traveling through the temples, gymnasiums, theaters, and festivals of ancient Greece, we are left with a question that is impossible to ignore. What do these bizarre sexual practices mean for us today? Were the Greeks simply more liberated than we are, or did their rituals and customs serve a deeper purpose that we have lost in our modern world? The legacy of Greek sexuality is complicated. On one hand, many of their practices seem shocking to us. Sacred prostitution, pederasty, public processions with giant phalluses, erotic plays performed before entire cities. Yet on the other hand, their culture gave us some of the very foundations of Western thought about love, beauty, and human desire. Consider Plato's Symposium, one of the most influential philosophical texts ever written. In it, Plato describes love, eros, as a ladder, beginning with physical attraction to beautiful bodies, then rising to an appreciation of beautiful souls, and finally reaching the contemplation of divine beauty itself. This idea shaped centuries of philosophy, art, and even religion. The concept that love can lead to something higher than mere pleasure is still with us today. Even our ideals of physical beauty are deeply influenced by the Greeks. The athletic, nude male statues of Kouroi became the model for Renaissance art, which in turn shaped modern standards of proportion and symmetry. When we admire a marble sculpture in a museum, we are participating in the same aesthetic tradition that once celebrated the beauty of young athletes competing in the nude. At the same time, modern society is far more private about sex than the Greeks were. Public nudity is taboo in most cultures today, and erotic imagery is often considered scandalous when displayed outside of controlled settings. This raises a provocative question. Have we actually become more liberated, or have we simply hidden sexuality behind closed doors, separating it from community and ritual? Some scholars argue that by making sex a purely private matter, we have lost its spiritual and social dimensions. The Greeks believed that sexuality could honor the gods, strengthen civic bonds, and even ensure fertility for the land. Today, sexuality is often reduced to entertainment or commerce, stripped of its deeper symbolic meaning. Could there be wisdom in the way the Greeks tied desire to something larger than the self, to the divine, to the community, to the cycles of life? Of course, not everything about Greek sexuality is admirable. The practice of pederasty, despite its cultural context, raises serious ethical concerns about power imbalance and consent. Their treatment of women, who were often married very young and excluded from public life, also reminds us that Greek society was deeply patriarchal. To romanticize the past without acknowledging its injustices would be a mistake. Yet it is precisely this complexity that makes ancient Greece so fascinating. It was a culture constantly negotiating between chaos and order, passion and reason. Their bizarre sexual customs were not just acts of indulgence. They were part of a larger conversation about what it means to be human. Desire, to the Greeks, was a force that could inspire greatness or lead to ruin, a force that needed to be understood, celebrated, and, when necessary, controlled. Perhaps that is why Greek myths are full of stories about love gone wrong, Zeus's endless affairs causing chaos, Aphrodite's jealousies leading to tragedy, mortals punished for giving in to lust without reverence. These myths were cautionary tales, reminding people that desire was powerful, a gift from the gods, but also a dangerous one. In a way, our modern world is still grappling with the same questions. We debate issues of consent, sexual identity, public morality, and the role of desire in politics and religion. We still argue about how much of sexuality should be private and how much should be celebrated openly. And we still turn to art, literature, and even film to explore these themes, just as the Greeks did through pottery, theater, and poetry. The story of Greek sexuality is ultimately a story about humanity itself, our endless struggle to balance the body and the soul, pleasure and duty, freedom and responsibility. Their world was not perfect, but it was bold, unapologetic, and deeply committed to exploring every aspect of human existence. As we look back on these bizarre practices, from the sacred prostitutes of Aphrodite's temple to the drunken worshippers of Dionysus, we may find ourselves asking, have we really changed so much? Or are we still searching for the same thing the Greeks were, a way to make sense of desire, to connect our most intimate urges with something meaningful, and to find harmony between the mortal and the divine? Perhaps that is the real legacy of ancient Greece, not the marble statues or the ruined temples, but the invitation to keep asking these questions, to keep exploring the mystery of Eros, and to see sexuality not as something merely to be hidden or exploited, but as a force that can shape our lives, our culture, and even our destiny.